Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of Like Zero Even, a live series where we go deep into extended reality and immersive technology. My name is Sonia Sadarasan, and I will be your host today. If you're watching from LinkedIn, from YouTube, drop a hello in the chat. Let us know what do you do, like where are you tuning from, and why this exact topic actually caught your attention. And if you want, like please send your way along the way, sorry, send your questions along the way, and we will pick them up as we go. Today's format actually is going to be a little different from our usual product spotlight because today we are actually sitting in the middle of something that is changing how immersive experience can be made. And we're going to look at it from the both sides of the table, from a designer's perspective and from a developer's perspective. For most of my career in XR design, there has been like an invisible wall between the designers and the build. Up until now, in a common XR development workflow, I prototype in a platform called ShipXR, which works amazing. But then I hand over a Figma interface specs plus a Unity package for a developers for a space specs. I design the whole experience, but when it comes to an actual implementation, I leave my hand and I hand it over to a developers. And at this stage, it's actually where I find like 75 of the iterations, things that happens between a design and code. Now, today we're going to be talking about CLAD. CLAD is a closed loop agentic development that is starting to, in my opinion, move that wall. It's an agentic way of building in for spectacles right inside the Lens studios. Now, for the past 2 weeks, I've been preparing for this session. I've been spending a real hands-on time with it. I built a project solo, while at the same time, I run it with a two-person project with another developer using CLAD in the middle of it. So I'm coming with a bit of a scars, but also a bit of a findings. And to put them into a conversation today, I've actually invited another side of that wall, which is a developer, uh, where the person on the other hand, where that hands off actually happens. And I'm really happy to have Andrew Douglas, a co-founder of a Sunflow VR and one of the Specs ambassador. Andrew, welcome. And first of all, thank you so much for being here. Tell us and the audience a little bit about you, about Sunflow VR, and your role as a Specs ambassador.
Yeah, hi. It's really great to be here. Really excited for this conversation. So I'm Andrew. I'm a XR developer and student from Edinburgh in Scotland. And for the past kind of 6 years now, I've been working in XR. Around about 2 to 3 years ago, I was fortunate enough to co-found Sunflower with my co-founder Inez. So she handles all the design and that sort of stuff, whereas I do all the sort of technical aspects. And together we make some really cool projects across bunch of different devices, but with a majority of the focus right now on the spectacles. And I remember being at AWE a few weeks ago when CLAD was announced for the first time, and you could really feel the excitement in the room. It was so exciting, and I remember just rushing back to my hotel room that evening just to try it out for the first time. I was instantly just blown away with how well it works. So it's such an exciting technology, and really excited to hear your views on it and everything.
Super cool. Yeah, I can totally imagine. To kind of like gather everybody together, right? Like with a good opener, because I'm sure that half of the people who will be watching this, like because they're probably curious, but another part are a little bit intimidated. From my standpoint, I don't come from a coding background, so what I was trying with it, I was describing a lot of like behavior. CLAD built it, ran it, showed me what works, what doesn't work functionally. But at least that is the idea of like the closed loop. But from your perspective, right? Like what is CLAD and what is actually happening right now when we're building in Lime Studio?
So I think for me, CLAD's just a perfect opportunity to get up and running with a project super quick. It's amazing for prototyping. Like normally when I work with Inez, she handles all the design stuff, I'm left on the programming. But if I'm ever doing a solo project, my design skills aren't very good at all. So I often feel a bit left behind when I'm doing the quick prototypes. I'll just be using cubes and spheres, scaling them up, doing whatever. It's not that pretty. But with CLAD, since it's closed loop and you've got all different agents doing different things, I found it's so good for things like VFX, basic 3D models, all of that. So it allows me to prototype super quick. And I think it's great for people just getting into lens development as well, because unlike developing for a 2D screen, something spatial is quite tricky to develop for. In comparison. So I think CLAD's really good at nailing some of the sort of spatial concepts as well, for just helping people to go from idea to actually functional prototype very quickly.
I see you use the word functioning. I think like I have a really good note about that we can pick up like later. But you mentioned about like it's a very fast tool to actually get you to prototyping. Now how much do you think? Well, maybe a bit of a background. Like right now, I'm currently running like a two-person project, right? Like between lens, and then again, based on my findings, is that I'm a designer and she's developers, and then we describe a behavior what we wanted, and CLAD confidently kind of like built it, but because my tandem is a developer, so she immediately see like this is a wrong library, like this is not the correct one, like how to do it. Though it was there was a correct tool, it could have like that particular library could be could be usable, but it would actually make the project like fragile. And so me being a designer, without like a knowledge of Lime Studio, I would have been able to build a prototype fragile. So that would get me to a questions: how much do we need to understand of Lime Studio to use CLAD versus just describing what we want?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think we'll see CLAD change quite a bit over the next, I don't know, few months or years as the technology sort of improves. So right now, I think for your more sort of basic prototypes, if you could call it that, maybe sort of just basic screens, dashboards, that sort of things, you can prompt it quite confidently and it'll produce a really good result. But for some of the more in-depth things, such as maybe placing things on tables and walls and all of that,
Yeah.
it does help to have a bit more of a background with like the names of things in like the Lens Studio API. So I think having some knowledge is really helpful for the more in-depth experiences. I think as a whole, it's pretty good at everything just kind of working from your first prompts.
Yeah, it makes sense probably because you did mention about that. Like, what we wanted to bring was a very simple behavior about like detecting a real surface and then
Okay.
placing an object like right, and then you kind of like take it out like the issue immediately there. So what you're saying actually is that while we do not need to actually write code with it, but also neither that we can be completely hands off of the platforms, not knowing anything about it, right? Uh, where do you think, like, for somebody who kind of like go in there and said, okay, I want to use CLAD today, but I want to be sure I kind of like make like a good enough prototype, like where do you think they should start?
I think before even opening CLAD for the first time, it's quite beneficial to open a bunch of the sample projects. Like Lens Studio is filled with some amazing sample projects for specs, and same with on GitHub, there's tons there. And just kind of going through them, playing them on the simulator, or if you have the device, testing it there, and just kind of seeing how things work, how things kind of connect together, figuring out things like if you want to make an AI request, that's done through like the remote service gateway, a lot of different things like that. I feel like all of the individual samples give really good starting points to sort of understand how developing of spectacles works. And then from there, it's quite useful to kind of go with CLAD afterwards. But I think instead of just jumping in blind for the first time, haven't really explored the platform, really good to look for all the samples to get a more kind of in-depth understanding of just how things work.
Do you think like those samples, so I've seen those samples and they're really good, yeah, those samples, like I agree with you, like seeing what's, so it's almost like seeing possibilities before you jump right into the platform itself, like they're really good. um, but do you think like those kind of like samples, like they're like good enough for like non-developers, like at this stage?
I think so. I think it depends on what your goal is. So I think with a lot of the samples, it's quite easy to sort of build off of. So you can start with it and then slightly kind of modify it, change a few things at a time to get to like the point that you want to be at, even if you're not too sort of, not much of a coder, not too familiar with all the programming stuff. I think that's also where CLAD really helps. It can see the basic project, can understand how all of that works, and then you could maybe say, oh, actually, when I click this button, I want a dragon to appear or something like that. So I think it's quite good at just helping you to build off of the basic projects as well.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. Okay, I want to flip the table a little bit, like from your perspective, because of course, like I've only seen like from my side of the SIP, which is from the designer SIP. In this like a two-person project, what I kind of noticed, like watching my developers work with alongside with me with CLAD in the middle, like how much of the value kind of change in a comparison to the normal workflow that we normally do, like in an Excel development. Why I say that, because I think the developers that I work with like spend no time on the stuff that I thought that she would be spending, and instead like on another stuff that I never even thought, like oh, we would need to do this. Like for example, at this point, if we kind of go into it, we have a bit of a gap like currently in the market, like building with CLAD with like the actual device on it. And so currently like she's kind of like running like two different Lens studios so that we can build in one and then test in another one. But a lot of those things that she's actually running is that it's like plumbing, you know. And so I was kind of like wondering, like from your perspective, like while building in like Lens Studio itself, what CLAD actually changed in your day to day as a developers in a comparison to how you used to run the show, doing it, like what you don't spend your hours doing anymore. But I think the most important thing is that what do you spend it on instead?
It's a really good question. So I think what's CLAD's really changed for me is often I'd have an idea, spend a few days sort of planning it out, thinking out, is it going to work in specs? Is it even right for like XR? And then, you got to test it, or you got to actually start making it. You spend a lot of time sort of designing and stuff to begin with. But with CLAD, I can just have the idea, refine it a bit in my head, give it a CLAD, wait for it to build it, and then sometimes I'll test on the device and I'm actually like, no, you know what, this isn't quite what I was looking for. So it speeds up that almost time for failure, if that makes any sense for me, quicker. So I
Yeah.
can have a prototype, realize, oh, actually, this does work. This is the sort of thing I want to invest more time in. And then actually, take it away, build more into and all of that. So I think my time has become a lot more intentional instead of just coming up with ideas, quickly having to build it all out like a very rough copy, testing on device. Instead, nowadays, I can be much more focused on, have a prototype, test it, cool, it works. And then from there, spending a lot more time building it out intentionally, adding the things I really care about, instead of just having to kind of rush it last minute.
Is there any project that you do this and you're like, okay, I'm pushing CLAD to like the end of it? Is there any project that either you're working right now, or you work with your co-founder that worth mentioning? That could be a good example, of course.
So together with Inez, we've not actually used CLAD that much together, as when we build, we quite like to have a very solid starting point. So we know what the design is going to be fully, a bunch of the code layout too, different structures, how all that's going to work, just so we can both kind of work on a project quite easily, interchange it. That's how we work. So we've not used CLAD much together in that sense, but what we have used it for is, again, quickly finding out, is our prototype feasible? I think CLAD is super, super good for like feasibility testing, if that makes sense. We've used it a ton for that. I'm trying to think of recent projects in which I pushed it to the limit. I think there's a bunch of great examples actually on r/spectacles. That's where the community is really pushing its limit. I saw a really cool one, I think it was last week, by this guy called Pavlov. He makes some super cool creations, but it was using an Anki vector robot. And with that, you were able to play like a sort of bouncing ball game with it. It was super cool. And I believe he did some of the programming for that using CLAD. I mean, there's tons of great examples there. As for one that I did recently, I made a app in which it was kind of designed for like nighttime relaxation. So you would lie back, you'd look up at the ceiling, and you'd see a bunch of like sort of clouds, like a sort of galaxy sort of effect. And then you'd have a virtual fishing rod, and you could grab these sort of dream things from the ceiling, and that worked pretty well. I was quite happy with how that's going along. So it's not finished just yet, but the majority of that development has been done using CLAD. So very happy with how it's going.
So you guys are also then running like this two version platforms
Yes.
things, like building it with CLAD and then like kind of implementing it with like the older one.
Yeah, at the moment for testing on device, but I'm getting more and more confident with CLAD being able to test itself. It's one of the less known bits about CLAD as a whole, I think, is LEAF. I believe it stands for Lens Evaluation Analysis Framework. Can't remember off the top of my head, I'll have to double check that. But that's really powerful. So it's essentially, I like to describe it to people as spatial unit tests. So you can set them up
Mhm.
yourself and run them in Editor, or CLAD does a really good job of just creating a test and running it itself. That's how I've actually done it 100% of the time so far. And then you can let it run in Editor, and it will test certain things within your lens, like is it able
Oh,
to move on to the next screen, is it can simulate hands and all of that. And I think that's not been spoken about enough, actually. It's a super powerful
no.
tool,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
has completely changed sort of how I develop as well. I don't always have to pick up my specs, test out the hand gestures. I can just let Lens Studio do it for me. Then that's been game changing, actually.
So it actually changes like the QA, like a manual
Yeah,
QA in a way.
yeah,
Yeah, because
completely.
I
It's
like I haven't also heard that use case being mentioned anywhere.
no,
How
it's a
like
less well known one, but it's definitely worth it trying out.
definitely saves a lot of hours where we used to like where as a designer or as a developers, like we spend a lot of times in. Okay, I think then it kind of goes into um, when you do that, right? Like when you actually like setting that up, like how do we actually build like our own test case, or do we work with CLAD like to build our own test case? Like how do you suggest that we actually run that, let's say like that QA agent, I guess in this case, like for your project, right?
Yeah, so I think initially when I was reading through documentation and everything, there's quite a lot it can do. So it essentially creates these scenarios, they're called, to test, and it runs
Yeah.
it and it checks how it goes. And there's like the expect with all of that stuff if you're familiar with how that works. But I ended up just getting CLAD to write them for me. And all the results so far I've really worked out. So I was
And you're happy with
kind
the
of
result so
skeptical
far?
actually going into it because I'd wanted
Yeah.
spatial unit tests for a while, but kind of thought I don't really know how those would work, how those would run or anything. But CLAD does a super good job of producing them and running them, and you get to see it running in the editor as well. And yeah, and then when a test does fail, CLAD's able to pick back up from it and kind of use what I found out about the error to keep building. So that's been a super invaluable tool in my development.
Like a good follow up on this, like that's actually a very very interesting thing on like where um, developers actually saves a lot of hours, and instead they can focus on like prototyping, whether something is visible, because well I guess like in spectacles we do have like some limited like field of view, and based on my prototyping experience is like a lot of the thing that we think is nice or is good or is visible, it's not in a certain field of view. Okay, so let me plan this one again. Like this is a bit personal to me. I think for years is that prototyping has, prototyping for designer mean like fake it as convincing as possible. Like that would means like we built like a clickable Figma, a motion mock-up, something that looks as alive as possible. And the gap between like that and a thing that actually runs, this is where developers go into the middle and then implement those things. But now with CLAD, this past some weeks, instead of giving those specs to the developers, I have now just feed it into the system itself. And I feel like this is then it goes a bit bigger than CLAD itself, because for years, like design has always been kind of like about converge, like we converge it on the best interface for the average user. While my personal take, I guess, like now that we're designing for wearables, and in this case, specs, uh, because the system actually can sense contacts and adapts. So the designer job right now changes from designing interface to actually designing behavior. I kind of read an article to some a while ago that says like some people are calling it like behavioral architects, and that's kind of like what they said. Like when if you're designing for a wearables today, that's what design driven experience really means right now, and the one that owns that is actually between a designer and a developers, which raise real questions. If from my side of the table as a designer I move up to a behavior, uh, does it also move a developer role from the way developer would normally run an XR projects?
I think that's a very good question. I think it's kind of just sped everything up quite a bit for me. So instead of kind of taking a Figma project and then having to wire all up, as you said, I think I have a lot more time to test it on device, check it's all polished, and I've been paying a lot more attention recently to like performance. Optimizing everything where
Okay.
I can. CLAD's quite good at kind of going back to it and saying, oh, actually, do you think we can maybe optimize this or that? So at the end of the day, the kind of end user does get a nicer experience too. They won't heat up as quick, or there'll be some compute left for extra things. So I think, yeah, it's definitely switching how I do develop, but it's not really pushing me out. It's just giving me more tasks to do and kind of spreading my focus elsewhere. So instead of just working on, taking a design and making it work and adding all the functionality there, I have much more time to check how it feels and that it runs properly, and testing a lot of different edge cases as well. I feel like I've been testing so many things just to check it all works.
Your co-founder, her name is Ines, right? You said.
Yes, it is.
So between you and Ines, right? Like you handle like the technicality, and Ines actually handles like more like the design part of it.
Yeah.
Um, I really like when you actually mention, which I didn't think about it before, about how in a normal development, like the one thing that always kind of like got pushed is actually the housekeeping, the hygiene of like the development itself, right? And like you always say, okay, we're gonna keep this later, and then at some point you kind of have
Yeah.
that code that's just piling up. And so it's really interesting because then you as a developers, then you also focus on like quality code, like it gives you time to focus on a quality code than anything else. Between you and Ines, like how do you guys go about like when you have like, let's say you have a new brief, like how would Sunflow VR kind of like handle it today?
Well, I think Inez is really good at taking this sort of idea, storyboard, whatever, and sort of figuring out how it should look, how it should sort of feel, play, all of that. And then from there, I can take that. And often I just quickly make sort of a brief little prototype, cubes, circles, whatever, just to check it works. Maybe we're trying some fancy VFX effect, or checking something on the spectacles. As we always have so many cool ideas for spectacles, but we just always got to check they work first. So
Yeah.
we create a very quick MVP, and then from there, what we do is we kind of take a step back, especially for the bigger projects on things like specs, and we think, okay, so the prototype works. How can we ensure that we don't get to 2 weeks from now and everything's just a complete mess, everything's all over the place, we're getting issues with Git, all of that. So we take a step back and we spend some time properly planning out how should the different screens look. Are we maybe going to use prefabs to have a bunch of things stuck together? What are the code structures going to look like? How can I quickly make a design change, or she could quickly make a code change, all of that. So I think we've become a lot more intentional with how we do things at different points as well.
Does that would mean that between you and her, right? Like you guys are actually doing like in a different, how do you say this? Like a different box, right? Like because you are running it, you did mention you are running it like under GitHub as well. So I think looking at the previous way, like how we would develop like in a normal XR development workflow, designer design, and then we hands off, and then you implement, and then you returned it like for all this QA, like, and this is the iterations, right? But from the way you kind of like explain it, what I kind of imagine there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you guys are kind of like developing this like together in a different branch.
Yeah, it's essentially there's always two branches. There's a main branch and often like a more arty branch. So we'll both be working at different things at the same time. Sometimes it's like I'll implement something and she'll design it. I'll move on to sort of implementing the next thing. Or often, especially towards the end, I'll find there's just a bunch of different things we're working on kind of at the same time. Maybe she'll be moving some things around to make them look nicer, or she's play tested it and she figures out that actually this thing should be changed. So yeah, it works really well. As much as more typically it is design codes and then sort of give back, by working sort of at the same time, it seems to just work quite well. We get a lot done a bit quicker.
Okay, then interesting things. Let's kind of like build the answer together here. Uh, from what I kind of let me offer what have shaped up until now for me. This has landed, and you can tear it apart based on your experience, of course. Uh, Up until now, because I did mention about like prototyping has always been like the voice of a job of a designers. But at least in like the project that I'm currently running is that I expected that voice would mean that I would go in first as a designers, which is I think all of the designers that are gonna be watching gonna be like yes. Uh, that this which is why like we have something called like a design driven experience, which would mean like design goes in first. And this is what a common way of doing it, like in an XR design, in a normal development, me prototyping that, implementing it. But in this project, like my developer tandem start with housekeeping first, and then it goes into function, and after function, she handed me the system, and then there is the task for me to design for the behavior and for the interface or whatever is needed for that. Uh, so it completely reversed like how the normally like we would do the normal things, and I'm still thinking whether that's the right shape of like doing it, right? Like from the developer side, I mean, you have worked with Ines, and then you have worked with like a lot of project as well, like on this. When a designer prototyping, when a designer like hand you a prototypes, for example, with CLAD in the middle, does that make your life easier, or it kind of like give another whole mess that supposedly we should be able to fix? And if yes, how do you suggest that?
Yeah, so I think CLAD's definitely changed the way all of this works. So I feel like nowadays on the projects, like you've been doing, there's a lot more of a sort of kind of putting down the groundwork to begin with, planning it all out. How should things work? How should it feel? And then sort of implementing the basics and then handing it off. But I think CLAD, in the way we've used it, has just been so good for testing if an idea is actually viable to begin with, especially on XR devices like specs and all of that. Sometimes I have an idea and I go to develop it and it just doesn't quite work. Not because the tech's not there yet, just because it's not actually best in XR. Maybe it's best in like just a standard flat format.
Another reason,
So
yeah.
really enjoy just finding all of that out first before spending a lot of time in it. And then it just allows us to become a lot more intentional with how we create it and go from there. But I think laying down the groundwork first for the projects is kind of all because of all this sort of AI stuff. It just makes it a lot easier to have that base level instead of getting AI to quickly create sort of all the code to begin with, because then often sort of building off that and editing it can become a bit more messy. So spending a good few hours to begin with, just planning out how it should all work, everything should move, all of that just saves a lot of time in the future.
And in terms of like well, I mean, at the end of the day, we're kind of like working with like a loop agent, which is supposedly what like from a design perspective, like if I'm handing you a prototype, a system, and then you need to kind of like implement the housekeeping of it, like you said, like the QA and things like this. uh, we did touch about like maybe you do need to understand a certain level of land studio in order to like go into like a good base of prototyping and going to you. Now imagine you're working with a completely new designers. And I say this because uh, I know Lamb Studio was actually made for developers first, like in the very beginning. And now they're a little bit more open, like into like with CLAD, they open a lot more to a non-developers. And so maybe the question, and hence the questions, from a development perspective, from your perspective, if you are working with like non-coder, doesn't need to be a designer, a non-coder artist, creators, designer, uh, how would you do about the onboarding to work with you?
That's a very good question. It's been a while since I've done that, admittedly, but I think it's always sort of the same. Maybe give them sort of like a basic project to build in Lens Studio, or just let them explore it. So many sort of good tutorials out there for exploring the software and understanding how it all works. So I feel like in comparison to maybe something like Unity or Unreal, this sort of floor for just being able to make something quickly and test it out is a lot lower. So in the past, when people have been trying out for the first time, often just tell them, oh, create something in Blender, for example, if you're doing something in 3D, then you can just export it across in Lens Studio, and it kind of just works like most of the time. Rarely importing issues, any of that. So I think it's quite a good tool for beginners to get started with, especially with stuff like CLAD. I mean, you can go from idea to actual, prototype running on device, provided you had. The next one's just instantly, and it's super cool. I feel like Lens Studio is now, it helps. It's really useful for sort of people who are just getting started and people who have been working in like the XR industry for years. So it's quite good at catering to all the different forms of people and everything. So I think it's really good software for just opening up, getting started with, mucking around with, and seeing what clicks.
Up until now, like based on this project that you kind of already made, you mentioned Blender, right? Like, and we do have like a couple more tools like out there in the market that we use to build like all of these assets, for example. Uh, Based on your experience, is there anything that we should know, or the audience should know, like whenever they kind of like opening the Lime Studio, like the limitation of like bringing assets, for example, like anything that to help them kind of like go about and say, okay, I'm gonna try working this out, but with this limitation in mind.
I think for developing on spectacles, one of the things to keep in mind is the different colors and how all of that works. Since the lenses are transparent, black
Yeah,
doesn't really show up. So for
yeah,
things like shadows and lighting, you're going to be a lot more sort of intentional with how it all looks. Instead of going for black, maybe use like a darkish gray for some shadows. And it's also quite a playful device, I find. I quite like using lenses, playing things where you pinch something and it's got a bit of a wiggle, or things just move a bit differently. You've got hovers when you're hovering over something. I think it's quite a fun device and platform to be like playful with. And I think as well, when it comes to importing or creating assets for spectacles, you should also be aware of some of the like technical limitations. So there's limits to how large an asset can be, like the number of polygons and everything in it, because the max size you can have running on it, I believe, at the moment is 25 megabytes. So you've got to keep your assets all nice and small. But Lens Studio does do a good job of compressing things. So once you've imported it within, it can bring down your sort of texture, megabyte size and everything. So it's pretty good at that. But I think a lot of it on spectacles as well is just creating an asset and then seeing how it looks on device. There's a lot of different things about how things look when they're up close to you compared to when they're far away,
yeah,
and
true.
just thinking about designs in different ways. Since you do have a somewhat limited field of view, you've got to be a lot more intentional about how you make a user look at something. So often it's like an audio cue, sort of direct them to look over there, or maybe you can use like a hint arrow which follows you around the screen. So I think it's quite a fun device to sort of design for as well. There's a lot more to think about than just making a phone app, for example.
Yeah. Well, what I kind of like notice, like when I kind of like go into Lime Studio, I've always designed for like VR, or even like for example in a mixed reality, right? But you mentioned about this color, which I feel like it's a really good point, because that was the thing that uh, normally I prototype, and I prototype in Shape XR, and they're really really good. But unless I use like their, so they have like what they call like a glasses simulator, and they do have spectacles also over there, which is then you can kind of see the colors and how is it different. But because that's not a common way of like the way we would prototype in a normal Alexa development, and so going into Lens, my personal experience was kind of, I forget about this like colors, and my background was like, wow, so many years ago I actually graduated like from like arts and design, where they teach us about like color theory. We don't use that as much anymore designing for XR. But when I come back like for designing wearables right now, it just it kind of like goes back about like, okay, I need to go and look at my color theory again, like where it happens, how it happens, what colors would go nice in an additive background, like like things like that. So it changes also it changes some skill that I need to have like also as a designer, going with it. Like last week when we actually like got to talk a little bit, like I kind of mentioned about like a platforms called Lureo. And about some months ago, we did another episode uh, with like one of their teams. Lureo is a like a no code AR platform from a company called Indizar. So like their episode can actually be found like in our list of episodes. Different angle entirely. Like so, what they focus on storytelling. So user can actually build a narrative scene inside the browser with like the command of like the 3D images, the sound, the keyframe movement, which is like if you imagine like Canva, but for 3D, is like that.
Cool. Okay.
So it's pretty cool. But then recently, I kind of like saw them like in a couple of Lens hackathon. And so I went in there and kind of like tried it myself, and I found out that we can actually now, like they're still under like limited access right now, but I think the company will be pretty open to kind of like let anybody who's interested to try it, because then we can kind of build like different storytelling with their platforms and use specs as like visualization tools to see it. So again, like it kind of like makes it faster to prototype, not only like within Lens Studio, but also like these platforms like Lureo. Lens has always been like they're all about their ecosystem, right? Like they're a closed ecosystem. Is there any other platform that that works like this, or any other like system that currently can work with spectacles that maybe would be good for people to have an idea of?
No, I think at the moment the only one I use is Lens Studio. It's just got everything in it for me, so I never find myself actually thinking, "Oh, I wish I had that. Wish I had whatever." The plugins on it as well, I also find quite useful, as that's all open. So if there is something I need, I can just make it myself, which I've done a few times. It's been pretty good.
Like
But
what, for
yeah, no, for
example?
me, so it was a little bit ago. They didn't have the option to set like a custom icon when you're making a lens, or you could
Okay.
set a custom icon. But I wanted to use AI to generate one, so I made my own plugin so I could just type in a wee prompts, send it to OpenAI, I'd just get the icon back and it'd be set for me. So it was super useful. Didn't have to go away, type it in, download it. It's all there. And I made one a little bit before that to visualize my code flow. So instead of just wondering where things are connected to each other, it sort of turned it into node-based programming. You couldn't drag them around or anything, but it would show you how different assets were connected to each other to like
Oh,
help with
that's pretty
performance debugging and
cool.
all of that. So yeah, I find Lens Studio great for just being able to, use by default. And if I need something else, I can just make it, or the community's probably made it already.
So what is the current plugin that you feel like is the most useful to kind of prototype like as quick as possible for anybody kind of going into it?
Oh, I don't know if there's like one set plugin I would recommend like that. I think there's just a bunch depending on your different use cases. I don't think there's any I've been using like a ton recently because, to be fair, most of my time has been with CLAD, just testing all of that out, seeing how all of that works. But yeah, there's tons of plugins available and different things in the asset library just to speed up development. Like when I was first trying out Lens Studio, I could barely use Blender at all. But there's tons of free like 3D assets and everything within the asset browser, so you can just drag them into your scene, see it dancing, panda or whatever in front of you. So lots of cool tools there, and definitely worth checking out.
Sorry, I didn't happen. So sorry. Real technical issue. Anyways, so you were saying like you were kind of like you didn't understand Blender at all, and then it kind of then with CLAD. So continue, please. Sorry.
Yeah, so I wasn't very good at Blender when I first started, but there was a bunch of 3D assets available within Lens Studio, within the asset browser, which you could just use. So that really helped me just kind of focus more on the programming, which I was mostly passionate about at the time. So yeah, I think Lens Studio is a great system for people, just getting started, and those have been programming for ages.
Kind of like, well, at least like based on my experience, not a lot with it, but at least like from the way I kind of like has been used CLAD like for the past 2 weeks, like kind of like every day, of course, from my perspective, apart from like to prepare like for this conversation, to really understand like how can I push CLAD like in a way of like from UX perspective. And at least up until now, my findings kind of like, for a lot of like these functional things that you mentioned, prototyping, CLAD is good like on functional things, because I think I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong, if CLAD is actually made like for a functional agent at this point. But because then I kind of like took it and kind of like push it into like UX, and I kept on asking motions, VFX, uh, design. Uh, my finding is that I have a lot more. How do you say this? Like iterations with it. Then, of course, with the one, if I, for example, I kind of like prototype in ShapeXR, for example, at this point. But what do you think about that? Like, it could be just me. It could be just like how I used it that made it like that. Any thoughts on that one? Any advice, maybe?
I think in terms of the design stuff, when I've been making it, I've been quite happy with the design it's had out of the box, so I've kind of left it there. With the VFX, I found it to be surprisingly good. Like I didn't think it'd be able to make things as good as it does in the few lenses I've made. But I think for a lot of the more things like the motion and all of that, it helps to get the leaf stuff to test it, so it can actually go through it, see it move, check if the motion and stuff works as expected. So I think Leaf is a very good way of like testing your different scenarios, so CLAD can see it, iterate through it, and then maybe you'd get a few better results. As I think once I started using Leaf, so I could actually test it all out, my improvements were much better. Yeah, but I think it does do quite a good job of understanding a lot of the spatial sort of ideas beforehand, like not having stuff stuck to your head. It should sort of lerp in front of you or just exist in 3D space. So I was pleasantly surprised at how well it handled that stuff, as I was a bit nervous going into it. Maybe it would just give you headlock content and everything. But no, it does understand it's living in sick stuff and not fixed.
Okay. So I've never actually tried that one yet, like to actually push like the 6 degree of freedoms. Like I have pushed into like the motion, the VFX. Like it does go into like a lot of iterations for me. Yes, at the end, like I could get there, but it's like an iterations together. Uh, like at the end, like when we use CLAD, like they always come out like with a caveat at the end, kind of like an advice like how to make it better. Based on your experience, is that worth following for it? Because
I
then
don't
that
know if
would
I've seen
also
that very
improve.
much.
Okay.
It could depend on like the model and stuff you're using as well, within like Cursor or Claude Code or whatever. So I've mostly been using it within Cursor, and I think I've been using the Composer model, and I found it to be quite good, like token usage versus quality for that. But that could completely depend on using Cloud or whatever.
Yep. In my part, they always come up with it. I never kind of like follow it because
Okay.
then that's why I was just wondering like is that worth following or not? Anyways, So one last questions that I have. Uh, for the people that are opening Land Studio tomorrow, what are your advice for using CLAD itself? Like from a developer's perspective, once you get that, like I will give it like from my design perspective.
So I think for opening Lens Studio and wanting to use CLAD, my advice would be before you use CLAD, look through a bunch of examples and see what is possible first within Lens Studio and specs. Give everything a play, try the AI ones especially. Those are very powerful. Work your way through maybe 2 or 3 of those. And then if it's your very first lens for specs using CLAD, maybe just start with something like a dashboard, like an interactive dashboard, some
Okay.
buttons, maybe using real-time data for like, I don't know, weather in the current city, something like that. Sort of keep it small and then build out from there when it's your first time. And then the more you make things, the more you'll also learn about different things such as, I don't know, world query, which is how you figure out, which sort of surface is it, flat, horizontal, whatever. And then once you start to know more of these terms, you can fit them in a bit more with your lenses. But yeah, I think to begin with, work through a bunch of examples and then build yourself a basic dashboard and then just go from there.
I will note that down for me. Now, from my part, I guess like from a designer perspective, one of the main one that I have kind of learned is that about this color theory, and it's how it's so important. Like when we're actually designing for wearables, uh, brush your color theory again, and then kind of like go into understanding, because up until now I think being a designer is also in an XR space, like it does mean that we need to understand like some of the tech that goes behind it, and today the tech that we have being an XR designers means Unity, and um, going into Lens Studio is completely different. Like now I kind of having to understand a bit more the workflow that is normally happening like within the developers arena, because now we're not doing it agile, we're actually working it together. Like I'm not giving you anything, like no, we are iterating at the same times in a different places. So I really need to kind of like understand how that like how GitHub would work, like that kind of thing. So that was like a really good learning for me as a designers. Thank you so much, Andrew. This has been like so. Let me see if we do have. Oh, we might not have like any questions, but thank you so much, Andrew. This exactly had been the conversation that I had hoped for. You have given a designer, and designers watching permission to build, and the developers with a bit of a clearer pictures about like where their craft kind of like move up the stack from here. Um, a while ago, I kind of read something by Mark Weiser. I don't know if you know it. Like I like how computing would disappear into a background of a daily life, and I feel like with I kind of see that a lot, and a lot more like when I go into CLAD, like designing for it, because then it's not even about the interface anymore, it's more about like a behavior. And think from my part as a designing using this, then it's not a solo act, but it's also like a designers and a developers with something like CLAD in the middle. This is going to get a lot more in the futures, and that's the part where we're kind of like figuring it out together. I wish you and Ines at the Sunflow we are the best, and I'll be watching what you guys are building on Specs closely. Is there any hackathon, any event, any product of what you guys are doing, anything from Specs that worth noting before I close this for people
I don't think so at the
to look
moment.
at
I
them?
think I'd recommend to everyone just keep an eye on the subreddit on Spectacles at like r/Spectacles. There's always so many cool things being posted there. It's really good for just taking or looking at projects and thinking, oh, that's cool. I'd never thought about that, and kind of building stuff on from there. There's always people sharing really cool like tips, cool questions, all of that. So I'd recommend checking out there. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really interesting having this conversation, just learning a lot more about the sort of design side of it all and how CLAD plays a role in all of that.
Yeah, definitely. A very big thank you to Michael Bankrover from XR for Europe for producing behind the scene as always, helping me and keeping Zero event running. And I would also like to say thank you so much for Joe Darko and Stephen Chu. Thank you so much for actually introducing me to Andrew and making this and supporting this event. If today sparked something, connect with us on LinkedIn. Connect with me. I share a lot of stories and practicals on design, building in XRs. Andrew, Douglas, and Sunflow VR. If you're building in spectacles and curious about CLAD, this is the person and the people that you want to talk to. XR Crowd for more live conversations, what's happening in the industry, and of course, XR for Europe for what's happening across XR in Europe. This episode is gonna be up in YouTube shortly, so rewatch it and share it and send it to one designers to another, developers to another who needs to see what's going on right now. And thank you so much again for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode of Zero Event. Take care, everyone.